Let me just welcome everyone. Hello, and welcome to our first virtual event. I hope everyone is doing well in these Corona times. We are from Building Bruges, a meetup group from Bruges in Belgium, and we usually do one event every quarter in real life. And if you're interested, you can go and check our website, buildingbruges.be, or follow us on Twitter at Building Bruges. Be sure to stay till the end of the session because we will announce our next event, especially if you're from Bruges. Now, because this is a virtual event, we have a more international audience, so obviously things are in English. Normally, we target local developers in and around Bruges, and we always give a present to the speaker, like a gift, some local or regional product. This time it's virtual, and we were trying to keep our carbon footprint low. So no gift for you, John, sorry.
That's
but we
fine.
have donated a small sum to Gendered Intelligence, which you can see the website there, which is a UK-based organization, because you're from the UK. It's an organization that supports young transgenders and increases understanding of gender diversity. So we want to support that. Also, I apologize if some of you received the meetup emails like multiple times with the password. That's because we have some trouble reaching everyone. With that being said, let me introduce Jon Skeet. Jon Skeet works for Google, and he helps develop the Google Cloud Platform client libraries for .NET. He's also the author of C# in Depth, a great book, and you can see the website there as well. And he also works on NodaTime, a superb datetime library for .NET as well. So thank you, John, for giving us this session. And with that being said, I think you can start your session.
Okay. So let me just start the screen share. This bit's always slightly awkward. There we go. Right. Hopefully Perfect. Everyone can see Be Kind to Speakers with Crashing Demos. Today we have no actual demos. This is a code-free session, but I've started putting Be Kind slides at the start and end of all my slide decks. The history of that being I went to a wonderful conference, Caribbean DevConf, and you can imagine where that was, which we were just treated wonderfully. It was a fabulous conference to be at, but I was doing the opening keynote, brief keynote, and I had put off writing the slides as I always do, and then I decided on the plane, do you know what, I know what I'm going to say and it doesn't need slides, so I won't have any slides. And then the conference organizer said, well, we can't just have a blank screen behind you, we've got this enormous screen, we need to have something. How about we put a picture of you in? It's like, that's a terrible idea. People are already having to see me once. They don't want a giant sized version of my head as well. So I just said, put Be Kind up there. I thought that's fine. And it resonated with people sufficiently. And I then expanded on it in my talk a bit, that it struck me that I want to make an explicit point of saying this at the start and end of each talk, because if I can encourage the tech community and move the needle even slightly so that we're a bit kinder to each other and to those outside the tech community, then that would actually do more good than making you all better at versioning and C# and date time things. So I'm sure you're all very kind people already. This isn't in any way a ticking off. It's a reminder, because I believe that if we're nudged, if I've said be kind and tomorrow maybe you're feeling grumpy because things happen that make us grumpy, then maybe something will just say, John said be kind. I will just try to reset myself a bit so I can be kinder with people I meet and not take out my grumpiness on them. Okay, that said, we are talking about versioning today. Versioning is a topic that just seems to not go away, and I sort of started a while ago doing date and time talks, and people still showed up to that. So I thought, well, what can I pick as a topic that would be even more boring sounding, at least, than dates and times? You know, versioning. What could anyone say in a whole talk about versioning? I say that somewhat jokingly. It's also that I have been running into a lot of versioning things at work and in .NET, and currently in work in a different way. We have a new slide that wouldn't have existed a few weeks ago that I'll talk about briefly, because it affects everyone. Before I go straight into versioning, though, I want to talk about Hanabi. And trust me, this isn't yet another diversion in the same way that Be Kind was, because Hanabi is a fabulous board-ish game. It's a tile game, a little bit like a card game. And the way that Hanabi has been described to me by the person who taught it to me, Jean, is that Hanabi is a game of trust and communication. And now when I teach other people Hanabi, as the introduction, that is always my first phrase. Hanabi is a game of trust and communication. And this is intimately related to versioning. In Hanabi, you can never give enough information to people. Everyone is working with partial information. You've only got a tiny amount that you can say at any one time, and yet you need to trust each other that you're going to do something. And if everyone plays their part and is worthy of trust and trusts other people, then you can do great things. Well, yeah, I said that was about Hanabi, but equally all of that applies to versioning. We have a small amount of information, you know, 3 numbers or 4 numbers, whatever it is, in order to communicate something that's really quite subtle. And if I'm consuming something that you have produced, I'm trusting that you know what you're doing with versioning. You need to trust that I will receive that and do the right thing with those version numbers that you give me. So it really is all about how much can you communicate with very little information, and then make sure that you are trustworthy. So today we'll be thinking a bit about what versions are at all, a sort of meta question. Thinking about how we use versions in very different ways depending on the context we're working in. And I am primarily thinking about the tech world. I don't go into versions beyond that. We'll talk about semantic versioning and what compatibility means. I will talk about the .NET versioning crisis that doesn't seem to have happened, but I'm not entirely sure why. And I'll talk a bit about API versioning, as in RPC APIs and cloud events at the end. So those are sort of some broad sections. And between each section, I've added for today a slide saying, right, let's have a question break. So if there are questions that you think of along the way, please just drop them into the Q&A bit, which I've used Zoom a fair amount in the last couple of months. I haven't been in a webinar version of Zoom before, so I'm hoping that the Q&A section works as simply as I would hope it would. It sort of seems like it should be fairly simple, but if with those little breaks, hopefully that will give us a chance to sort of take a mental breath and answer any questions on one topic before we move on to the next thing. Okay, so what's the point of a version in the first place? What is a version? What do we use them for? Like in Hanabi, they're used to communicate, and usually they form some kind of contract between 2 parties. Okay, and that's really vague and deliberately so. They're usually some kind of identifier, and that's an interesting word itself. What does it identify? And there are usually relationships between different versions. So the identifier that I use today and the identifier that I use tomorrow, there may or may not be something that you can tell just by looking at those what they mean. We're talking about evolution. So versioning something that never changes is really boring. It's actually very easy as well. But you generally have a target of evolution that does change. So things like a library, Nodatime has a version number. Every NuGet package in the world has a version because you can't publish it without a version. You could just say, well, this is version 0. I think that would be legal in NuGet. I'm not entirely sure. Certainly 0.1 would be, but it's always got one. Likewise, languages, as in computer languages, sometimes have versions. Sometimes those versions aren't terribly clear. So C# has actually been quite good at this. We came out with C# 1.0. I say we, you know, the world had C# 1.0. We then moved to C# 1.2, which is slightly alarming. Then 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, 5, rather than 5.0, I think, 6, then 7.0, 7.1, 7.2, 7.3, because Microsoft decided, hey, let's go with the whole minor versions thing again. And then C# 8. And as far as I know, we're not getting an 8.1. It's going straight to C# 9. I haven't actually spoken to the C# team. I might ask this. As it happens, I have a meeting with folks from Microsoft almost directly after this talk. So I shall ask whether they deemed that the minor versions with C# 7 were just a mistake that they're not going to do again, or whether it just so happens that they haven't wanted to do an 8.1. But anyway, C# has all those versions. Node has versions, but Node is more of a platform rather than JavaScript, the language that it uses. What are the versions of JavaScript? What are the versions of Java? C++ is fairly regimented in its versions, but aren't just 2.0, etc. Different languages may or may not do things differently, and the meaning of 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 in C# is not the same as 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 in a library. There can be examples of platforms. I mentioned Node earlier on, and sometimes the platform and the language come together. So Java really only has one version number. I mean, there's whole, is it Java 1.5 or Java 5? But that's more of a marketing thing. Typically, Java comes, here's the language and platform at the same time, but you can use the later language with the older version of the runtime, or vice versa to some, yeah. So there's all kinds of complex relationships between the targets. And also, just as a less techie example, although somewhat techie, books can have versions. So this is C# in depth, the 3rd edition. So not quite up to date. I have several copies of 4th edition in a box down there. And at some point I need to start on the 5th edition. Oh, I'm now destroying my shed. Sorry, if I don't get things right now, it will cause chaos later on. So what does it mean for a book? Is that C# in depth 1, 2, 3, and 4? I don't know. It's definitely, 1st edition is slightly different to a normal version number. And in particular, my wife is a children's author. And Holly has written, I think her list of published books is up to 140 or something. It's ridiculous. She's absurdly talented and incredibly productive. So she's published loads of books. She hasn't written any 2nd editions in the way that I have for C# in depth, but things have come out in a 2nd edition, which has usually been just a reprint or a reprint with a few little changes in. So even within one sort of context, books, different things can mean, different versions can mean different things for the exact context. Okay. So I've just realized I've been one slide behind half the time. Oh no, I haven't. It's fine. Sorry. PowerPoint is confusing me. So let's think about what a version consists of. I mentioned an identifier before. It's textual almost always, and I know none of you don't need to be told that versions are text. What you need to think about is, had I assumed that, just had I even thought about it? It's really trying to work out, when we talk about a version, what do we mean and what assumptions do we have? As it happens, in my experience, almost all versions are also in ASCII, even if they're for international products. I haven't seen version numbers be localized. So for cultures that don't even use the digits that 0 to 9 and dots, I think versions are still usually expressed with 0 to 9. One interesting difference, whole separate categories of versions, is human memorable or not. So as an example, I don't think many people would be able to remember the whole of a git commit SHA, at least not to roll off the tip of their tongue. They might, if it's something you use a lot, you might remember the 7 or 8 character version of it, but not usually. And we don't tend to use git commits for that kind of version that you need to discuss. You absolutely need to be able to express it if you're on in a GitHub repo or wherever you are, and you want to say, well, this change caused a problem, then having the git SHA is absolutely great. But for the most part, you're fine to copy paste that. You rarely need to say it over the phone, etc. One other aspect of versioning that we don't tend to think about very carefully, but can make a huge difference, is whether a version is an identity. So consider NuGet, where versions are real identities. So if someone installs Nodetime 3.0.0, which I released last Friday, if you install 3.0.0 and then someone else installs 3.0.0 in a week's time, you will have the same bits. NuGet guarantees that. It's, I suspect, possible that if there are extreme security measures, they might have some way of overriding things, but they probably say, do you know what, the most extreme we can do is physically deleting our copy of the package, and you can't delete things from other people's computers, release a 3.0.1. But the idea that 3.0.0 should mean one thing is very common for libraries, but not necessarily for other uses of versioning. We'll talk about that near the end of the session. Okay, what else might a version be? They might be partially ordered in time. So suppose I'm doing semantic versioning. I would always release a 1.2.0 after 1.1.0. And that sounds entirely sensible. But I might then release a 1.1.1 if I've got a security bug that I only found after I'd released 1.2.0, and maybe it's not even in 1.2.0, but it was in 1.1.0, I might then release 1.1.1. So you can tell the ordering to some extent, but not always directly. And then you've got git commits again, which aren't even partially ordered as far as you can tell just from looking at the identifier. If you've got access to the Git repository, you can see which commit came first. That's fine. Doesn't mean it was necessarily written that way. Things could be reordered and stuff, but it's definitely not feasible just from the commit hash itself to tell that. And that's just in terms of time. There can also be partial ordering in terms of compatibility. We're going to come fairly shortly onto semantic versioning. But the idea of semantic versioning is to give you some kind of contracts saying what you can predict. And this comes back to the idea of trust that I mentioned earlier on. Versioning is a contract. It's saying, well, I'm going to have some changes, because if I don't change anything, I don't need to version. This is the category of changes that you can expect going from 121 to 122, or from 121 to 130, or from 121 to 200. It's a contract. Finally, there can also be aliases, like Debian 9 is also called stretch, and there can be separate marketing names from the technical version. I mentioned before that there's Java 5 versus Java 1.5. That's very old. It's been a long time since I've been deeply embedded in the Java community. I don't know whether things have got any better in terms of versioning, given that there's now Oracle's JDK and OpenJDK. Some things may have simplified while other things become more complicated. But there can also be these separate marketing names. And as an example of that, Visual Studio 2017 was VS 15. So you would find directories with 15.9 or whatever, and that was for Visual Studio 2017. Whereas Visual Studio 2015 was VS 14. And it got a bit confusing sometimes. Visual Studio 2013, I think, was the golden age where the version number matched the marketing number. So just as some examples, and this slide was written a while ago, they were current at the time. Now the world has moved on, but all of these are still valid as one context. So thinking about .NET, there's the .NET Framework version 4.7.2 was out at around the same time as .NET Core SDK 2.2.200, and the .NET Core SDK is versioned in an interesting way where what we'd normally think of as the patch number really does include features, but is slightly different to the minor version, the 2.2 versus 2.3, etc. That SDK came with the runtime of 2.2.1, and that runtime implemented .NET Standard 2.0, which some people found confusing. And I remember being on a conference call when we were trying to think, what comes after .NET Standard 2.0? Is it 2.1? Is it 3? Is it 2.5 to make it sort of clear that it's very different to anything? Is it .NET Standard 10 so that it's miles apart from the .NET Core side of things? And that was all decided long before the decision to skip to .NET 5 and have just .NET rather than .NET Core. So you can see that there's a lot of marketing involved here as well. And those things are often used with Visual Studio 2017, which, as I've said, the current version when I was writing this was 15.9. I think I'm currently on Visual Studio 2019 version 16.6. So I've mentioned a few things around what can be versioned in terms of libraries, languages. There are also applications, operating systems, platforms like .NET Core with SDKs, runtime elements, contracts, etc. There are also protocols, RPCs, REST APIs, HTTP itself, the underlying transport. We're used to HTTP 1.0, 1.1, 2.0 and 3.0 with Quick and things, and also individual resources like files in source control and resources within a networked API. So you can imagine, at least in some cases, having a resource of, here's a document, and this document is at version 2, and I make a change and send it back, and it's now at version 3. The point of reinforcing this context aspect is that your context changes the requirements. So if you are building an application, you are likely to, very, very likely to have dependencies. You need to know how your dependencies behave with respect to their versions. If you depend on a library version 1.2 and you see that there's been a release of it, version 2.0, do you take that update? It's not as simple as it might sound like it should be. If you're building a library or a network API, you're at the other end of the relationship. You need to understand what your callers, what your clients will expect. And those aren't just two, poles apart things. If I'm building a library, I may well depend on other libraries, and I will depend on network APIs as well. So if they start breaking things, then I need to signal to my callers that things are broken as well, and it all gets quite tricky. One thing you should take away from this talk is that you shouldn't expect one answer to fit all contexts. And that's, you know, true of virtually every talk I give. You know, there is no silver bullet. But it's worth explicitly thinking about it rather than say, oh, versioning's hard. Okay, well, I'll come to it when I come to it. Have a think about what your context is and how that affects how you version things. So as an example, if everyone who uses your code is internal, so if you can see every caller to your library, that puts you in an incredibly powerful position. You know that you can remove a method that no one's calling, so long as people aren't using it by reflection or something. In some cases, you may even be in a position, certainly in Google, we have very powerful tools and systems that let you say, I want to change this method that I know is called by hundreds of thousands of different projects, because we do have hundreds of thousands of projects. And if you're trying to refactor something that's really core, maybe it's as simple as you made a typo in a parameter name. Oh, how do you fix that? You can, if you've got the tooling that can alter all the source code, which you can only do if you can see all of the source code. And you can only be confident in it if you have good tests for everywhere. So we have a good test culture at Google. So when there are these large-scale changes, we can be reasonably confident before we check anything in, because it runs all the tests, and that takes a very long time. If it tests everything that's affected by your change, and that change is hundreds of thousands of files, then that will take a long time. And sometimes you'll get outliers that are, well, this test has been flaky recently because someone else has broken things. You know, with as many developers as we have in Google, not everything is going to be green all the time, however hard you try. But you have tools at your disposal. Compare that with the open source world, or even if you have commercial libraries, but you can't see how people are using them. You really don't know how people are using things, so you don't know whether you can remove a method. You say, well, that method was a really bad idea. I don't think anyone's using it. I'll just remove it. Well, how safe is that? I have no idea. So libraries, public libraries, whether they're open source or commercial, are one thing. And I will just say here that there are some bits of information like nougat.org download numbers. If I release a 2.5 and then I notice that I've made a mistake, but I see that there are 0 downloads, can I unlist it immediately, fix it, and release just a 2.6 in a way that would be a breaking change for 2.5, but no one's got 2.5 as far as I'm aware? It's tricky. Someone could manually say, I want to get 2.5 and still pull it from NuGet that way. Whether anyone does or not, that's a different matter. And then you've got networked APIs, which are somewhere in between the two. So if I publish a network API with a schema and people generate libraries from that schema, if I can tell whether a field is present in a request, and I can see that no one has specified that field ever in any requests, or maybe I've got a friendly bunch of alpha testers, no one's specifying it, can I remove it? Well, it depends. You need to think about how much you're willing to risk people using your request class in ways that doesn't actually talk to your RPC, your API. There's nothing to stop them from doing it, even though you might expect it not to break anyone. So you need to think at that point, okay, I've got this field I want to remove. Maybe I've got a better way of doing stuff and it's badly named. I've got pretty much 3 options. I could either take a breaking change and say, this is a breaking change, everyone's got to have a new major version. That's really expensive because major versioning is expensive. It's a pain for both you as an API producer and for API consumers. You could live with it forever, deprecate it, but keep it there, which may be a real pain if you want to actually reuse that field name, but give it a different type, and that would break people. So you've used something up, you've permanently got a sort of scar on your API. So that's not good. Or you can risk breaking people and risk the reputational damage. You don't want to get a reputation for breaking your customers. But if you're fairly convinced that it's not actually going to break people, it's a theoretical breaking change rather than a real one, then maybe that's the best option. So that's where context is so important. Okay, I'm going to take a break to have a bit of water for one thing and check. I don't see any questions. At this point, I'll just ask Peter to unmute himself and say hi, just so that I know that...
Hi.
Okay, good, right, good. I am still audible. One of the risks with doing a remote presentation rather than meeting is that my internet could have gone down and me not notice at all somehow. With no actual questions, it can be very hard to tell, and I can't see any of you good folks. So I'm hoping that all made sense given the lack of questions. And even if I would say I hope you're not getting bored already, but what I'm asking you to think about is more fundamental aspects of versioning than we tend to get caught up in nitty-gritty and don't take the step back to think, okay, well, how does my current context affect things broadly? How could I maybe generalize this one situation within my context? Which context does it not apply to and why? And what do I mean by a version? Okay, right, we have a couple of questions now. So on the be kind part before the talk, if you have a digital discussion, which we have a lot more during this weird period with someone, do you have any tips on how to be kind without having to start every sentence with an excuse or by using more emoticons than words? I feel the lack of body language or direct interaction makes this way harder. And no, I'm not going to ignore it, because even though it's a distraction from versioning, it's probably quite a welcome one. I think I hope as software engineers, we're in a better position to do this well than many other professions, partly because, I don't know about you, but I'm used to remote meetings and have been for a long time, but partly we're used to communicating complex information in relatively tightly enforced environments. Coming back to Hanabi and versioning, when you're writing software, you're writing it for the computer and for people. So I've always thought, or certainly for a long time thought, that empathy and communication are actually the key skills for software engineers. You need to have empathy with your users and with who's maintaining the code later on, whether that's you or someone else. And you need to be able to communicate efficiently, but empathetically. Now, in terms of concrete tips, I guess taking a pause before you say things, if you know you've got to communicate difficult things, and I know I've got a conversation coming up that I'm really not looking forward to, and I will need to take a breath before any particularly controversial statements or questions. And it's that consciousness. It's like being conscious of being kind. Just thinking about it, I think, helps you do it. So the fact that you're already aware, Bart, the fact that you're already aware that we're lacking some of the body language, I think will already be helping you. And just maybe next time you're about to go into a meeting that you think may be tricky, think, hey, I asked that question. I should really take some time to make sure I'm being clear. I would say that humor can often go wrong when you don't have a rich bandwidth, and particularly when there are different cultures involved. Very quick anecdote. I was at a conference in Sweden, and there was an American presenter came, and he made two big mistakes. I mean, I can't remember much about his talk other than these mistakes. Firstly, he had, after every sort of 5 slides, he had a picture of a model, as in glamour model, most female and occasionally a hunk oiled up and stuff. And he said, oh, that's just for the women in the audience, I wanted to include this. And it was entirely the wrong tone. And maybe it would have been okay in some, or okay is a strong word, maybe it would have gone down better in some other cultures, but certainly in the culture in Sweden, it was just seen as completely inappropriate. And at another point in the talk, this person said, right, so we all want smaller government. We don't want government doing too much for us. And someone shouted, dude, you're in Sweden. We love the government. It's sort of this difference in culture can make communication hard. And if you think you're being funny and it ends up winding someone up, rubbing them up the wrong way, that can destroy the rest of the meeting. As I said, I don't remember anything about this person's presentation other than what they got wrong culturally, and it was all unnecessary. If he hadn't assumed things about people's views on government, if he hadn't just stuck those completely inappropriate pictures in, it would have been fine, and maybe I'd have really enjoyed the talk. So humor's great between friends if you are really confident that it will come off, and even there are some things that are safe to be humorous about, but really think about it. Great question though. Thomas or Tomasz, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it. How do we approach obsoleting things through more versions into the future? How do we announce things up front? How? That's actually a great question that leads into the next topic, which is semantic versioning. So rather than answer it now and then repeat myself, if it's okay with you, I will go into the into semantic versioning. Oh, we now have 2 more questions. Oh, several questions. Right, so one is Q&A test. I'm not sure.
I think someone was testing.
Oh, that's just testing.
Feature.
Okay,
Yeah,
right. So I will dismiss that. Yep, that's fine. Okay. Why are major burdens such a major versions such a burden for the consumer? Thank you, Git. I hope I will cover that in semantic versioning. I certainly intend to. If I forget to do so, then please just put the same question again, because it's really, really important to understand. And another from Tomasz saying, being kind in general helps you to progress further, even though it seems to be slower. Completely agree. Yes, I'm very much one for slow and steady progress in human relationships. Sometimes in software, it's great to prototype things, move fast and break stuff. It can be really hard putting that stuff together again when they're human relationships. Fabulous. Thank you. Okay, so semantic versioning. Many people talk about semantic versioning, and we rarely look at what it actually means, certainly not in detail. So some of this may be very familiar to you, some less so. In basic terms, if we have a version number like 1.2.3, and I haven't gone into pre-releases and things in this section. If we've got 1, 2, 3, then here 1 is the major version, 2 is the minor version, and 3 is the patch version. And I tend to talk about major version bumps, minor version bumps, or patch version bumps. So a major version bump would be to go to 2.0.0. A minor version bump would be to go to 1.3.0. And a patch version bump would be to go to 1.2.4. So if you want to make a change, you know the change that you want to make, how do you decide which of these to pick? The basic rules are, if it's a breaking change, you have to bump the major version. So if someone has code that currently works and it won't work with your change in place, then you need to go to 2.0.0. If you are adding functionality without breaking anyone, but doing so in a way that means if people use that functionality, they can't go back, then that's a minor version bump. So typically, I mean, this is probably the most common form of version bump is I've added some more methods, some more properties, some more classes. It means that anyone can update, and if I'm using 123 and you release 130 and it contains some more classes, my current code doesn't depend on those, but it should work fine. But if I start using those classes, I can't then go back from 130 back to 123. So it's sort of forward compatible, or maybe it's backward compatible, but not forward compatible. Whereas a patch version bump, you're meant to be able to freely go, as a consumer, freely choose between 120, 121, 122, 123, 124, 125, etc. Now, why would you, something's got to change, otherwise it's pointless. Maybe it's a documentation only change. That would make sense for a patch release. It could be a bug fix that maybe you don't need. It's for some minor corner case, and if you do depend on that, and maybe you depend on the bug being present, then it is a breaking change to move forward from 123 to 124. If I've got some string length function and actually it always gives one more than it should do, and I fix that, but you've got code that says, I know that there's this bug here, I will account for it by subtracting one, then it's a breaking change. But equally, it's just a bug fix. So it's somewhere between the two, and most things aren't that obvious. The clear thing is, it can never, a patch version bump can never include new classes, new methods, new properties that are public. If things are entirely internal, then that's fine. And well, I say that's fine. It's up to you to decide your rules, but I would normally think that's fine. It's detectable, and maybe someone could start depending on it by using reflection, but that's probably reasonable to say, well, you're opting into something that's deeply unsafe. You can access the private variables and things. I reserve the right to change my internals and privates, but not publics. So that's the basics of semantic versioning. Now, I've said multiple times there about breaking things. Okay, so what's a breaking change? I'm mostly talking in this section about libraries because that's where semantic versioning tends to be a big thing. As an example of how it doesn't quite translate to applications, Zoom currently has a new major version rolling out, and if you aren't already on Zoom Client 5, then you need to be by the end of Saturday, otherwise on Sunday you won't be able to connect to things. I mean, it'll download the new version, I'm sure. So that's a major version bump, despite the fact that I think from the user perspective it wouldn't be breaking. But there is a big breaking thing between 5.02 and 5.03. I know about this because I'm responsible for our church services. I sort of do all the switching of speakers and things. And in 5.03, if you as a participant are running 5.03, I can't unmute you. I can request that you unmute, but I can't unmute you even if I previously muted you. And that's a breaking change. It's going to be a very, very big breaking change for our way of doing things in church. And we're going to need to talk to people about how they unmute themselves and things much more. Is that a problem? Should they have said that that's version 6? I don't know. There's less of an obvious contract. So let's get back to libraries. I would say almost any change to the public API can break something. Can break someone, and maybe you need to define what you view as breaking. If you had a method that previously would not accept a null reference, and you say, do you know what, excuse me, actually a lot of people call this and want to be able to pass in null and it just be a no-op. So I'll make that more lenient, where previously it would throw argument null exception. Is that a breaking change? Definitely, in a way, because suppose I have got a parameter that I'm accepting into my method, and it's named the same as your method's parameter, and I want to use it, but I want to validate that it's not null. Your previous behavior validated that it was not null for me. If I called the method, passing in that parameter as the argument, and I could rely on that's going to throw argument null exception. Well, if you start not throwing argument null exception, then I go on to the next bit of code, which may be, you know, wipe someone's bank account, and then it goes bang later on. That's a pretty serious bug that you've introduced into my code just because I was relying on your previously documented behavior of I'm not going to accept null. There are other kind of subtle things. Adding an overload for a method is almost always a breaking change, even though it's really obscure. And I guess a superpower I could have potentially is the kind of thing I think I'd be good at, is you give me a before and after of any change, and I will find some code that will break when you make that change. But maybe, and I would certainly say, adding an overload, usually, certainly if it's a different number of parameters, or they're very different parameters, and it would be really hard for that to cause an ambiguity. You'd have to be trying to break stuff. That doesn't feel like it's worth a major version bump, because as I said, I'll come back to, it's costly for consumers. Things like changing a field into a property. Some people say, oh, I'll only make it a property when I need to add some behavior. I'll just make a public field for now. It's fine. It'll be a compatible change later on. Well, yeah, not so much. In various different ways. Even changing the name of a parameter. Before C#4, that would have been reasonably okay for C#, but not for VB. But with named arguments, if you change the parameter name, suddenly someone who's specifying that parameter name at their call site, you've broken them. Even adding a class, you know, what could possibly go wrong adding a class? Well, if you're importing system and you're using type somewhere, you're importing system and you're importing Jon Skeet fab library, and you're using type, you know, type x equals some object.getType. What if I add a class called type into my Jon Skeet's fab library namespace? Suddenly it's ambiguous. Does that mean we should never add a public class between minor versions? Surely not. All it means is it's really subtle, and you need to think about this. There are also things like performance changes that could break people. You know, in Nodetime, we've sometimes made trade-offs saying, well, we'll make this significantly faster that I expect to be a common case, but it will slow down this other case. And, you know, that might break people, but I don't care about that too much. There's also kinds of compatibility where you have source compatibility. If you recompile all your code, it will still work. Binary compatibility, I've already built this application. If I just switch in a new version of the library, does it still work, or do I need to recompile? And there can be chain dependencies and all kinds of things. Let's take a little think about, well, I'm going to come to dependencies in .NET later on. I'm just trying to work out, knowing that we're fairly short of time already. I'm going to come back to the why are major versions a pain in the next section, which is more about .NET dependencies. I will now take a question break because I am running slow as ever. What's a good versioning approach for a commercial desktop application where the concept of a breaking change doesn't apply? In my previous job, we tried to apply semantic versioning to our product, but we struggled with the major version bumps since there really wasn't a breaking change from the point of view of the end user. So maybe you just decide we're not going to do it. We're going to say our versions are aligned with marketing, because to some extent, if you say we're not going to actually break our users, that means it will always be version 1, because unless if you decide to follow semantic versioning, and that's probably not terribly useful. Just like having a version doesn't make sense if something's never going to change. Well, if you're always going to be compatible, why call it 1 dot something at all? Do you think your users would prefer to hear 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 1.346, or would they prefer 1.0, 1.1 with some minor changes, 1.2 with some more minor changes, 2.0 because we've done something big? It feels like that's just not somewhere that semantic versioning is useful to consumers. For things that act as SDKs and applications, it gets a bit trickier. But good question. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've talked a bit about semantic versioning. We've talked about versions in general. I'm now going to talk about dependencies and diamond dependencies and how .NET is just in a terrible situation. And I will come back to Christoph's question as we go. So you're writing a library. Imagine you're writing a library and you depend on Node-time, and your release is 1.2.3, the same one that we had before. And you depend on an ancient version of Node-time, 1.1.0. If you want to upgrade the version of Node-time that you're using, what do you have to do? This again will depend on some, you need to make the decision. The decision that I've tended to make is generally, if you believe that the library you're depending on is following semantic versioning, then you follow the same policy. If all you're doing is updating dependencies, you need to follow the same kind of bump as they did. So if they had a patch, you need to do a patch release. If you did if they did a minor release, you still need to make a minor release as well, because if you do a patch, well then they're going to transitively get that dependency, so they might, the application or yet another library that's depending on it might start using that, the Node-time 1.2 might start using new functionality, and they can't go back to a previous patch version of your library because that would depend on the earlier version of Node-time which didn't have it. They could add a dependency directly on Node-time and be okay again, but it's trickier. And certainly with breaking changes, well, if we've gone from Node-time 2 to Node-time 3, you ought to make your version bump a major version bump as well, because all your consumers are also indirectly consuming that. And this comes back to why it's such a pain to do a major version bump. And it's all about diamond dependencies. So suppose you're an application that depends on libx and liby, and those both depend on libz. What happens if they depend on different major versions of libz? In .NET currently, they end up with libz 3.2, and libx is unaware that it's got a different version from the one that that it expected. It was expecting 1.2, it's got 3.2. That's pretty terrible. There's nothing guaranteeing. It could be that there are no types in common. libz might have decided to rename everything between 1.0 and 3.0. And it doesn't even have to be via other dependencies. You can have just a direct one. So if the application depends on a more recent version of the library than of libz than your other dependency does. I believe that .NET will generally complain if you say, I want libz 1.2, and you're depending on libx that wants libz 3.2, so the other way around than I've shown on this slide. that will cause a build failure, which is good. But in general, we've got this, well, we'll just use the latest. So that means that anytime you have this unstable, I would think of this as an unstable situation, because we've got libx that wants 1.2 and gets 3.2. We should be able to do better than this. I've been talking with Richlander a bit about this, and we don't have an answer that fixes things, but we do have some thoughts around how we can mitigate it to some extent. One idea is the idea of a private dependency. So if we go back to this here, suppose libx and liby could say, right, well, I want to depend on libz, but I don't want to expose any of the libz types within my API. They're just, they're an implementation detail for me. At that point, it would be really nice if you could say, compiler, please enforce that they're just an implementation dependency. Warn, or make an error if I try to return something or accept a parameter of type something from libz. And at that point, no code probably needs to work with both libz 1.2 and 3.2. And if we can do something, for example, suppose we started naming our assemblies with the major version number in, so we'd have libz1.dll and libz3.dll. At that point, the app can work and everything is nice. But only if those are private dependencies. If libx and liby both need to return things from their library Zs, then the application needs to think, well, which do I use? And in particular, you couldn't pass something from that was returned by libx to liby. There are other problems with this. What if there's a static in libz and it's meant to be a singleton, but you've got libz1 and libz3 at this point? We get problems. So I think there are significant opportunities around private dependencies. I haven't dived into them in enough detail with sort of Imo Landworth and the people who could really tear the ideas apart. But we do have a significant problem here. So this is why releasing a new major version is such a problem, because I've just released NodeTime 3 and I have tried to actually keep it as compatible as I can, other than I've removed binary serialization. That's the major breaking change. So if you imagine libx being some library, doesn't matter which, but libz here being NodeTime, and instead of 1.2 it's 2.4 and 3.0, I'm hoping that it will actually work, but I'm certainly not promising that it will, because if I could promise it, it wouldn't be 3.0. If you're writing a library that you want to depend on NodeTime, which version do you pick? Because if one of your consumers is an application, it might have other dependencies that depend on NodeTime too. So from that perspective, it's really useful for you to depend on NodeTime too, but it might have things that depend on NodeTime 3. So there's this sort of viral nature, basically, of major version bumps. And so far we've got away with it because JSON.NET hasn't really had many breaking changes. And I call out JSON.NET very, very specifically because it is, I think, by far the most prevalent library dependency. So not part of the .NET framework that's kind of manages its own versions and sorts things out. Can you imagine if JSON.NET had made huge breaking changes between, say, version 11 and version 12? I haven't talked to James Newton-King about this. My guess is that there are a very few corner cases that are breaking changes that have forced him to take, I think we're at version 12 now. It's possible that things could break, but by and large, everything's non-breaking. But there's no guarantee of that. So the apocalypse comes if actually James Newton-King says, okay, JSON.NET 13, I'm bored with using newtonsoft.json as the namespace. I will call it json.net because that's what everyone calls it. That's what the namespace is going to be. I think that's a real test for the platform itself, that we're surviving just by kind of coincidence at the moment. So I hope that answers why it's a problem to do major version bumps. I will now go into the question break again, and just to save you from giving me feedback of this, I realized that I should probably have spent less time on the initial sort of contextual, what are we thinking about versioning, and sort of dived into the more .NET specific stuff earlier. I hope I've answered that about major versions being a burden for the consumer, particularly if the consumer is also a producer. If they're just a, if you're just consuming a library in an application, then it's still a burden because you've got to retest everything. If you see that something has gone from 1.1 to 1.2, you should have a fair degree of confidence that you're okay to take the upgrade. If you're going from 1.1 to 2.0, then you need to expect that it may well go wrong. And hopefully you'll find that by building and just running your tests. But you should at least be more nervous because the library author is signaling, hey, stuff could have changed here in ways that break you. And that's, if I say it's a hostile thing to do, it's not a friendly message to hear, is I may have broken you. For good reasons, obviously, there's a reason why Node time still isn't at 1.x. I needed to make some breaking changes in order to enable other good things. But it does add more burden for testing, for general compatibility, as well as diamond dependencies. Okay, so questions around making things obsolete. My approach in Node time has been to announce things fairly early, but those are often, announcements often don't make very much headway. We did an interesting thing between 1.3 and 2.0, where 2.0 was a very significant breaking change. We changed the precision involved, so it went from ticks to nanoseconds, and I removed a bunch of things. You know, nothing. I didn't go out of my way to break anyone, but if I thought that something would be better afterwards, I definitely removed it. So we have an abstraction of what's the current time called iClock, and between version 1 and version 2, I went from it being a UTC now property to a get current time in UTC, I think it is, or get current instant, that's it, method. So any code that was using iClock would just be broken, okay, no doubt about that. And I expect code using Node time to do that. So I announced that this was going to happen, and I released 2.0, and then I released 1.4. And what 1.4 did was add a compatibility layer as best I could. It wasn't perfect, but where possible, I would deprecate things. So I think I deprecated the now property in iClock, which is the only thing that was in iClock, but added an extension method with get current instant. So with a bit of work, and it would be a bit of work, you could migrate your code from 1.3 to 1.4 and get rid of all the warnings, and then be more confident that bumping up to 2.0 would be less painful. Now, obviously, you could just say, do you know what? I'm fine with just taking the break. I'll go from 1.3 to 2.0. It was designed to be another option of incrementality. Won't work for all situations. It's just an interesting pattern that I thought was useful. What we didn't do, which someone did suggest, was deprecate things in 2.0 and then remove them in 3.0. I took the view that, no, we're doing a major version bump. That's the opportunity to break stuff. Otherwise, you end up with twice as many major versions as you want because you always go through this deprecation period. It felt a bit pointless. Now, for 3.0, I did, in fact, deprecate something, partly because I did it very shortly before the 3.0, and partly in this particular case, it didn't do much harm, whereas having more members on an interface than you want is really problematic because other people might be implementing that interface. There's also one thing I want to mention in terms of making stuff obsolete, which is something we're really missing in .NET at the moment, and maybe I should suggest this to the language team, is an experimental. We have the obsolete attribute. We don't have an experimental attribute, which would let me put stuff in and say, well, I want to take the temperature of folks with this, ideally without doing just beta releases. I want to have a new production ready version that's got this in, but I don't want to make any guarantees about the API at the moment. So if you could have an experimental thing and then you could opt into it, so you say, I want you to make the experimental stuff available to me, and you're sort of saying, I know that I could be broken by a later version in these particular ways, I think that would be really useful. Right, so that's done those questions. Is it possible to automate versioning, or do you strongly suggest to always do it manually? I've started using a hybrid model, which is I version manually, but I check automatically, at least for my main work. So we have a breaking change detector, which we've decided what counts as a breaking change, or what counts as, for each kind of change that we detect, we say, does that need to be in a patch, minor or major? And when we run the build, it compares the previous version with the new version and says, I think this should be a minor change. It's then up to the developer to assign the right version number, and that's often not as simple as it sounds, because do I move from 3.0 to 3.1 or to 3.1 beta 1? So there are things around minor version bumps and pre-releases that aren't terribly obvious. So that's where I think give information to make the developer able to make the right choice in a reliable way. Right, running through the rest of the questions. Nodatime has the time zone database embedded in the library. Updating that database is a patch version, and that's by far the most common cause of Nodatime patches. So every time there's a new version of the IANA time zone database, I roll out, well, currently 2.4 and will be 3.0. And I try to do that sort of within 12 hours of the database being rolled out. And that is just a patch version. And it's off a branch, so it's not from master. I've got a branch of 3.0x and 2.4.x, precisely so that it doesn't take into account any stuff that I don't think I'm kind of ready to commit to that API, but that is just patch. Is it breaking if you depend on a time zone ID and then you decide to roll back to an earlier patch where that time zone ID wasn't present? Well, I've decided that that doesn't count as a breaking change in my versioning. I hope that's okay with you, but it feels like it's the best sort of balance. Good question though, and good to see that people are using Nodatime. I would think that private dependencies are the most common for libraries. Is that correct in your experience? Depends on the library. Sorry to be like that, but it does. So Nodatime has a single dependency, which is on private.compilerservices.unsafe or something like that. Definitely a private dependency. My API client libraries have very public dependencies. We have some support libraries called GACs, Google API extensions, which contain things like call settings and interfaces that enable pagination and the base class for client builders, so that you can configure a client and then say build, and then you've got a client ready to use. And those have to be public because, hey, they're base classes of things. So it's hard to say on a broad level. I think the more system level the library is, like Nodatime I regard as a system-like library, in that the functionality it provides would not be amiss in the system. And if you want to lobby Microsoft to put Nodatime into .NET, be my guest. I would be very happy to be to wash my hands of it. Not because I don't enjoy it, but I have many things that I could do with my time. Whereas the API client libraries are definitely not system level in any way, shape or form. And I think it makes more sense for those to depend on other libraries. Will protobuf or message pack have breaking changes? I don't know what message pack is. Protobuf is, there can be breaking changes. It gets quite subtle. We're currently trying to work out how to release something which will break users in a correctable way if they're using an old version of the C# compiler, older than C# 7.2 or 7.3, I think. They will shortly, if they start regenerating their protobuf code, they will have stuff that they can't compile against unless they hash define something, because that's better than taking a major version bump for reasons that we've talked about before, particularly with protobuf, where we've got one version number that's across multiple platforms as well. So that gets really complicated. I can't answer about the far-flung future. We're in Proto 3 versus Proto 2 that was mostly in Proto syntax. I don't know, to be honest, and I don't know about message pack. Just reading through the questions, and I think what I'm going to do is ditch the last portion of the talk, because my voice, as you can hear, is packing up and I've got a 2-hour meeting ahead of me. So let's just go through these questions. Any tips or stories on how to balance the size of your library and what it does versus forcing everyone to use multiple dependencies and multiple libraries to do the same thing? I expect the size of some libraries are the main reason why they're such a heavy dependency and hard to apply big changes or updates. Node at time I try to keep small. grpc.core is 127 megs. It's at the opposite end of the spectrum, mostly because it's got huge native binaries. So I think there can be size in multiple things. There's size in API surface and size in actual download. And I've worked quite hard to keep the time zone database really quite small in node at time. It's a couple of 100K. If that were 10 megs, that wouldn't make node at time any harder to evolve. Whereas if I had a far bigger API surface, then that makes it more likely that I need to do changes and more likely that those changes need to be breaking. The question of multiple libraries or a single library is an interesting one, though. What I would be saying in the next section is, as well as maintaining the client libraries for APIs, I'm now branching into cloud events and just trying to work out our strategy as Google for how we tell people about what's going to be in cloud events. We're going to use protobuf as our main source of truth, also publish JSON schema, but we will probably generate from those protobuf classes. So do we have one library per event source? So one for a storage object is being finalized, a storage object is being created, a storage object is being deleted, a storage object has its metadata updated, or maybe one per service. Here's all the storage events for objects and buckets, or maybe just one with everything in. Currently, I'm favoring the latter because this changes relatively rarely. So the costs involved in larger libraries are that things change more often, which means that consumers end up feeling they ought to update, maybe NuGet's prompting them, or dependency bot or whatever, but they're not getting any benefit. If you only use 1% of what's in a library, then an update may well not affect you and it gets annoying. On the other hand, depending on multiple things, gets annoying in different ways. So it's very much a balancing act. I guess my only tip is to try to think about it from the consumer's perspective. How likely is it that people will use multiple event types? How much do you want to be able to version them separately? For client libraries, we have always in .NET, or since I started working on the client libraries, we've kept them to not just this API, but this major version, or this version in general of the API. So you'll find there are different packages for speech.v1 and speech.v1 beta 1, because they talk different APIs. They have similar types in, but I wanted to be able to version them separately. In particular, I want to be able to do a GA, so a 1.0 of speech.v1, but how could I do that if it included things from speech.v1 beta 1? Because those can change in breaking ways and it would be a bit of a nonsense. So yeah, my tip for everything is think before you do. Next up, would you say it's better to bundle up major changes so the user only has to go through the pain of upgrading once, or release them incrementally? Definitely bundle up. We did this, so the end of last year, sort of September last year to early March this year, a lot of my time was spent planning GAX 3.0. We had to do it because grpc.core had taken a 2.0. We had to change how we did async things and all kinds of stuff. Wanted to update our target frameworks. We bundled that all into one major version because we knew it would be costly. Because as soon as client libraries start, as soon as other libraries start depending on the client libraries, then every time we do a major version, they've got another decision point about do they need to update and bump their own major version, and what about people who depend on them, etc. So yes, I think I would try to do a major version of a library less than once a year. Ideally, no more than once every 2-3 years. Doesn't always work out that way, but I don't think people can really complain if you do a major version once every 3 years. If you do it once every 6 months, that's a lot of pain. I'm really losing my voice. Message packets like JSON but fast and small, doesn't help me know whether they'll take breaking changes, sorry. Orchestrations in the same repo. When we bump one, all are bumped. Creating a separate repo for each orchestration seems to be overkill and losing overview. I don't know exactly what you mean by orchestration in this case, and that's my fault, not yours. If it doesn't cause pain for other people for you to bump everything, then absolutely do whatever's simplest. Within the API client libraries, we initially, even though we had separate packages, for the first few months, we said, okay, well, we'll have one version number across everything. We rapidly decided that was a bad idea. I'm publishing 80 API client libraries, and the idea of trying to keep all of those with one version number, when some are in beta, some are not beta, etc., didn't work for me. So think about what the consequences are for you and for your consumers of bumping everything versus, so I guess there are options of bump everything but they have independent version numbers, bump everything but they all have the same version number, or only bump what you need to bump and naturally they only have independent version numbers. Okay, I'm going to try to get to the end of these questions, but my voice is really going. What's your preference in terms of applying versioning to an API, path, query string, content negotiation, etc.? That would be the last part of my talk. In very, very brief terms, have a major version only, or what we're doing in Google is having a major version only. So there is V1, and unlike a NuGet package where V100 always means the same, V1 itself evolves without us having to tell you that anything's happening, but we try to keep that to non-breaking changes. If you need to make a breaking change, that goes to V2. You can also have streams of V1 alpha and V1 beta. I will say that 30-second overview belies 3 years of negotiating with API producers and infrastructure producers and API consumers and library producers. Versioning for network APIs is hard. Finally, how do you version groups of NuGet packages if you have two packages that are often used together, but you split them up so people can use them separately? So as an example, NodeTime and NodeTime.testing. Both are on version 2. You update only one of them with a breaking change. Well, if they're entirely independent, you can do that. If the other one hasn't had any changes itself, but depends on the first, so NodeTime.testing depends on NodeTime. So when NodeTime went to 3, we want a NodeTime.testing version 3 as well. So we bump them both. If they were independent, I don't know. I would have to think. I would say things can be confusing, but you can document them. So you can document your way out of confusion. It's hard to document your way out of a diamond dependency. So where there are things that you might do that would really hurt consumers. By consumers, I mean other developers consuming your libraries, that you can avoid, and you might confuse them, but you won't hurt them, if you see what I mean. You might inadvertently hurt them because they do the wrong thing because they're confused. So obviously you take every action you can to mitigate that. But there are definitely things that you can do where the pain of making things simple is more than the pain of making people think a bit and adding some confusion. At that point, I'm going to bow out and say thank you very much. Your attention has been much appreciated, and those were great questions that showed that you're thinking, I appreciate that you're thinking about versioning in the same kind of ways that I'm thinking about versioning. So that was great. Thank you ever so much for having me.
Okay, thanks for that, John. It was very, very interesting. One last question, if anyone wants to follow you, where can they find you? Twitter or a blog or?
Peter, I don't know if you're still muted, but I can't hear you. Oh, I know why. Because no one else had said anything for ages. My speakers decided to turn off.
Oh.
Now I can hear. Okay.
So my question was, if anyone wants to follow you or your writings and stuff, where can they find you?
So I'm Jon Skeet on Twitter. I have a blog of codeblog.jonskeet.uk and just blog.jonskeet.uk, which is mostly about feminism, but anything other than code, really. I haven't blogged much recently, I should say, so don't expect much there. I tweet every so often.
Okay, well, thanks for the interesting talk. One last thing for people that live in or around Bruges, we will probably, if measures allow, have a next event in September. We're going to try a workshop on legacy code. The idea being you pair programming. You do some pair programming where basic programming skills are sufficient, and then you'll move on to other workstations. The idea being you experience what it is to work in other people's code and how easily technical depth occurs and starts. As soon as we know more, we'll post everything on our website, buildingbruges.be. And with that being said, John, once again, thanks. Everyone, thank you for attending, and stay safe, and see you some other time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.